There's a prevailing current in games by paradox, and indeed in the wider genre of historical strategy, including things from Civ to Total War, whereby the player has a sort of absolute power. I've talked about this briefly with respect to Victoria 2 in the past, and I've addressed an overlapping concern when looking at how Civ 6 handles declines, but now I want to take a comprehensive swing at articulating what I've previously called player autocracy. To do so, we're going to intermittently discuss a few games, mostly in the Paradox catalog, but all with, I think, approachable examples. One could, likely, broaden out the application of the term player autocracy to a whole heap of genres, and in fact, I'm completely sure it applies to anything involving management or what would, in the real world, require immense delegation. The nature of player autocracy is found in, as we'll see, recognizing when things shouldn't be so easy. For example, there's probably a whole conversation to be had about how smooth and seamless building a new city in Cities Skylines is, how little resistance there is to any given choice. But with that all said, let's actually define the term. Player autocracy is the measure or condition of absolute control the player has over the actions taken in a game. It is, at its simplest, the fact that the player, and thus the act of play, involve unchallenged power. It is less one solid moment or thing than it is a gradient of control that the player has over mechanics and information of a game. As such, it is easiest to pick apart when we have something grounded, like our real-world history, to contrast. Without contrast, it hardly differs from the expectation of a frictionless experience. In real life, even the most empowered king wouldn't have as perfect control over the economy or troop movements as in a Paradox game, if you follow. I will note here that this is not, or at least is more than, just an argument for more complex systems in games. In fact, it's hardly an argument for anything, so much as an exploration of a way games are made and what players expect from them, and where we might look to understand them better. Player autocracy is, largely, a gameplay necessity, or it can be. That's one of the points I'd like to dissect a bit more, and one of the best ways to do that is to establish a shared understanding of these games and then work our way into discussing the ways they can be played. In order to do that, we'll first start with foundation building, with defining terms that feel like they might need no definition, and then we'll get into a case study of sorts. From there, it's on to talking about the sides of gameplay, of how player autocracy manifests, and in turn, how it affects player agency. Let's start with the basics, some fundamental gameplay elements to get us in the swing of looking at games through the lens of player control and its inverse, player disempowerment. As is often the case when talking about history games, we have to start with some kind of common understanding of who the player is. Yes, the player is France in some kind of way, and if someone asked, who did you pick to play? France would be an acceptable answer in any Paradox game chronologically past Crusader Kings or in a given Civ title, and so on. But the distinction of what being France means is important. Are we the leader of France? Are we the collective French people? The spirit of the nation? It changes a little from game to game, but no answer feels entirely correct. We, the player, are directing the history and actions of a nation, and it's often in ways that transcend the limits, actions, and consequences of government. In Civilization, this means we both are and are not Napoleon, which himself is and isn't Napoleon. Oh man, this is gonna get in the weeds. What I mean is that Napoleon was a human man who lived through the turn of the 18th century into the 19th and had a lasting impact on the direction of French history. He is a symbol of the nation, though not its sole representative on this earth. In Civ, he's the sole immortal representative, a humanization or embodiment of France, a spirit of the nation, so to speak. And we are, or are not, him. The game addresses us as such, but also with distance. Do you see why this is tedious and tricky? Paradox games vary a little, here and there, with the player role, but overall they end up in that vague spot of being less limited than a real-world president or king, while also not being, in most cases, all that tied down, neither to armies, nor government, nor form. More than anything, the player is directing history itself, but from a limited perspective. The player is conducting the history of Colombia as it transforms into Gran Colombia and later becomes the fictional but hypothetical Federation of the Andes. Those are different nations of different peoples with new governments and cabinets that span the lifetime of entire generations. We are not so limited as governments, not so fleeting as human lives, and not so trapped as to simply be the spirit of the nation. We are everything implied by a switch country button. Along the way, other nations, the computer players, are part of the story just as much as they are targets and antagonists and collaborators in creating a narrative of history. And it's important to establish all that so we can move forward with understanding our role, its power, and its limitations. But before that, we have to talk about the other player. Mirroring the last section, I'd like to start this section with a seemingly obvious question. Who is the AI? By which I mean, who is the computer player relative to the player? There are a few answers, but chief among them for us is that the computer players are opponents, obstacles, and collaborators in gameplay, and in the construction of both a gameplay narrative as well as a historical narrative. In order for the obstruction to the player to feel like meaningful gameplay and not just tedium, it has to be good. But that idea of good AI might need some defining in order to be useful to us. Say Sardinia-Piedmont, due to bad AI, doesn't take full advantage of its amazing potential to industrialize as the sole North Italian nation with a source of coal. But also, thanks to that bad AI, the other Italian states have an actual chance at being the ones to form Italy, both in the AI hands and in the player hands. The bad AI allows for variety. And before you grab a pitchfork and say I'm defending lazy devs or pretending something bad is good, actually, I'd ask that you hear out this full section first. It is a tangent to discuss, but fundamentally this game is built on a materialist understanding of history, which is to say that things like resource access are pretty central. While not strictly scientific in an input-output way, this lends itself to logical conclusions, like the regions with heavy industry being the ones with coal and iron, if you follow. So, in theory, Sardinia-Piedmont should be intrinsically geared to be the dominant industrialized Italian state, yes? Perfect AI would produce that outcome, given the input of its material conditions. Perfect AI wouldn't allow for deviation from history, and the game would look less like a game and more like a clockwork diorama. For some people that may already feel true for different reasons. We've been over this before in an older video, but it bears repeat in the context of AI precisely because the player is afforded their agency in the negative space of AI agency. It is the failure of Sardinia-Piedmont that allows for the rise of a papacy-led unified Italy. Player action is only half the story. AI weakness or inaction is the other. But that leads us to yet another question regarding good AI and proper AI behavior. What should it ideally look like? And in turn, how context-sensitive is that question? Take, for example, Russia. Should a good Russia AI hold on to reactionary power structures for as long as possible, even potentially eclipsing historical Tsarist Russia in terms of repression, or should it rapidly embrace reforms? Which is Russia trying to be the best country? Of course, the Russian AI failing to heavily industrialize looks bad in one lens and good in another. How do we interpret this? Should we condemn historical failings to become AI tendencies or expectations? The best answer I can come up with is that we want it so that if Russia fails, it is either as consequence of historical conditions or as a consequence of player actions. The game is working properly if Russia's weakness comes from serfdom, not from just never building a sulfur mine. Point being, bad AI might make the game easier or different, and in some sense potentially predictable in its own ways, hampering historical outcomes in others, but it also broadens player agency by leaving room, so to speak, for player excellence. That's not perfect, but it is the reality of these games and always will be. Power in these games is zero-sum, and thus it is grasped in the moments of another nation's failings. Agency is power. When people talk about bad AI, they usually do so with the impression of incompetent computer players, specifically when they don't take advantage of or even seem to know how to operate certain game mechanics. For example, AI England in EU4 being bad at transporting its troops, or sieges being abandoned moments before completion. And of course, from the player's view, England is only incompetent as an ally, and enemies always know when to stick to a siege. Or more specifically, scaring the AI off of a siege is a tactic. Outwitting the AI is gameplay. The AI has to make mistakes for the sake of gameplay. And from that, we can flip things and look at overconfident AI as also bad. In general, when talking about games where the computer player is the main opponent, there are two extremes to ideally avoid. An AI so bad it needs tons of cheats, and a computer player that is simply too good at micro-intensive actions, too good at assessing risks, too aware of the odds, and so on. It's easy to program an overcompetent AI, and it's another thing entirely to program AI that hits a balance. Mind you, that's not me calling Paradox AI perfect or saying there's some advanced reason why Civ AI will kill its melee warriors against your walls before the siege equipment gets there, so much as that the AI has to fail sometimes to be good. With this, we have both sides covered and can move on to getting a grasp on how this all plays out with the strange case of Victoria 2 and a made-up ideology. To start, I'll caveat that while I think this comparison highlights things well, many of these lessons will apply to other Paradox games and different situations. This is not a Victoria-exclusive gameplay dynamic. With that, let's talk about control, command economies, and whatever an anarcho-liberal is. To start this case study of sorts, let's quickly address the idea of anarcho-liberalism. Liberalism as a political philosophy in its 19th century context means quite a few things and has different elements to it depending on where one was in the world. That said, there are some core tenets of liberalism one can point to, and they do help us guess at what anarcho-liberal means in the Victoria II context. Liberalism on paper is the belief in the supremacy of individual liberties and their enshrinement in some form of social contract, often in practice taking the form of constitutions. In the 19th century, the cause of democratizing could vary from the more radical anti-monarchists to more in favor of constitutional monarchy, and also vary in terms of nationalism. These causes overlapped to an extent, and it's why the 1848 Springtime of the Peoples is also referred to as the Springtime of Nations. Important to the ideology of liberalism, however, is some form of codification, of enshrinement of rights into law. Now, I'm going to explain Victoria II's anarcho-liberals with only the slightest exploration of the anarcho side of things. Anarchy on its most literal level means absent a leader. Monarch means one leader. Oligarch means few leaders, and so on. I don't have space here to get into the nuance of how this word is applied and misapplied, but just know that in this case it's likely a misapplication. Put another way, it's more anarchy means an absence of government than absence of hierarchy, especially given the government they enact is bourgeois despotism. Now, given the absence of government approach, how does that square away with 19th century liberalism and the social contract? Well, it sort of doesn't. Or rather, the social contract that these people present is an extreme version of the old adage, the government that governs least governs best. The anarcho-liberals are essentially against government intervention in anything. As to why they're in the game, it's because each of the ideologies has its extreme version. Conservatives have reactionaries, socialists have communists, and of course, liberals have anarcho-liberals. I've seen it suggested before that replacing their nonsensical title with the term radicals, like in the Jacobin sense, might fix the historical issues of the faction, but that only creates further complications. We'll get there. Let's start with how the anarcho-liberals even take power in the first place and the ways players are empowered or disempowered in that process, and compare it to Victoria 3. In Victoria 2, there are two relevant population values when it comes to the discontent of a population: militancy and consciousness. Militancy is the discontentedness itself, the political will to change one's situation, while consciousness is like a... How do I explain this without just talking about class consciousness, which feels like using the word to describe the definition? Okay, so consciousness is essentially both how aware a pop is of their position and why their needs aren't met, and how targeted and informed a pop is with their militancy. Put another way, a non-conscious pop won't vote in its own interests, won't rebel in its own interests. This leads to a situation in Victoria 2 where one can use the militancy accrued by war exhaustion to push liberalizing reforms that nobody asked for as a downright reactionary government. The system isn't perfect. Militancy means people might revolt, consciousness makes militancy based on unmet needs and poverty more likely. That's the idea. The crux of what makes this relevant to us is that from the player perspective, revolts seem either trivial or extreme. Because either a very small group of conscious people get militant and are easily crushed, or you're later into the game that heavily incentivizes improving literacy, and thus consciousness, and that makes militancy a sensitive value. And then there's the fact that you get shown an average militancy for your country, which might say 1, but then a given movement has a militancy of 7. The average isn't very useful. When coupled with the fact that militancy goes up from 1 to 9, but values 1 through 6 have no effect, the revolts can feel sudden. One small thing can set a pop off, and then, boom, there's more rebels in your country than you thought there were people. Now the question becomes how a player is expected to interact with this rebellion, or with the possibility of a revolt, and the answer is, you kind of can't. Passing a liberalizing reform to lower the pressure just isn't always an option. There isn't much information passed to you in a timely manner, and then the revolt just happens and it's either small and can be mopped up, or it's every tile with a stack the size of your army. The player could prevent it by passing laws, but government in Victoria 2 is more out of player hands than Victoria 3. Both games strive to have what Victoria 3 calls clout be a consequence of indirect conditions like wealth, but it's less manipulable in Victoria 2. You have an upper house legislature that determines by its voting percentages what laws are passable at a given time, and more often than not, despite the population wanting some kind of reform, they just aren't represented in the upper house vote, and your hands are, in the moment, tied. You have to wait for people to get mad in order to do things. You are always reactive. And if you fail to address concerns, the movement for a given law change might instead become rebels. Let's suppose now that these rebels are anarcho-liberals. So the anarcho-liberals win and take over the government. You, the player, did not side with them, but you still get to be the player, if you follow. You are now heading a country with these laws: free trade, laissez-faire, secularism, full citizenship, pro-military. And they've established a dictatorship, so you, the player, cannot simply change ruling parties and thus change the laws. It's not exactly a government by Jacobin radicals, as sometimes people suggest, so much as it is, very clearly, government by an elite that is specifically fixated on the idea of the free market. The ideals of democracy clearly matter less than the laissez-faire economy model and free trade policy. If you've only played Victoria 3, that might not mean much to you, but free trade and laissez-faire are different in Victoria 2, as is what dictatorship means here. This is where the anarcho-liberal takeover intersects with our interests. In Victoria 2, laissez-faire leaves all factory building, closing, placement, and subsidizing up to the computer. The player is disempowered. Free trade under the anarcho-liberals forces the tariffs down. Way down. This starves the player of money and can, in turn, demand a reduction of expenses like the education system or military. In Victoria 3, those laws change the rate of things, but not the player ability to do anything. In free trade, the player doesn't get tariffs, but it's not like they're disempowered from deciding who to trade with and what for, and laissez-faire merely determines both the size of the investment pool and how many construction sectors are allocated to it. The only thing it disallows is subsidizing certain buildings. The player, as the state in this moment, can still open new factories, still change production methods, and so on. You're not trapped watching the computer capitalists open another cannery in a desert. And trapped is an important keyword here because of the aforementioned dictatorship. It takes a revolution to get the player free from the anarcho-liberal gameplay lock. It should be noted that Victoria 3 didn't start with a private building sector, and now that it has one, the illusion of a capitalist group building what suits them is incomplete. But to be fair, it's a hard illusion to build out from an abstract origin. What I mean is that the game cannot model the idea of specific known capitalists or corporations building more of their own industry. When we see the queue list another fruit plantation, we don't assume it will be owned by the same pops as the last one, the same executive board, so to speak. Companies are a recent addition that sort of help with this, but you get what I mean. The private sector is a block when it comes to building. And on that note, given the player has absolute control over production methods, a sometimes subtle but extreme example of player autocracy, the private ownership can't ever feel truly like they are innovators or possess their own factories. After all, for $0, the government can just decide it owns the railways. The second mutual funds is discovered, every business goes public on the stock exchange at the player's whim. The autocracy and abstraction work together to, in some way, erode the presence of private industry in a game about the conflict of interest groups over issues like private industry. That's how Victoria 3 more or less only offers flavors of command economies. A command economy is one where the state has absolute control over manufacturing. In essence, the economy is guided, organized, and set by quotas. The idea is more or less to coordinate so as to not overproduce goods and to meet shortages whenever possible. In theory, this is what Victoria 3 is always like, and part of that comes down to how the player has a perfect understanding of the market when it comes to needs and deficits, which inadvertently makes the private sector look like they're bad at choosing what to build. They are bad AI. Which, again, with the Russia paradox of good AI, would capitalists always make industries that suit the interests of the state and long-term profitability interwoven with a carefully planned economy? Or would they make choices that don't directly benefit the vision of the player and sometimes fail? So from here we come to another element of the NLib takeover, the shape of the government. The anarcho-liberal takeover changes one's nation to rule by bourgeois dictatorship, which I suppose means rule by the middle class, or in context specifically free market desiring business owners. In practice, this government enacts the policies I started the section with, but it also seeks to repeal social law advancements, like healthcare, while leaving political law changes where they are. The government, though nonsensical in some ways, at least has a distinct shape, even if its gameplay elements boil down to not being able to control the economy as completely and usually being pro-war. If an NLib party was anti-war, that well and truly would lock the player down. A key difference here between the games is that while in Victoria 3 one would have interest groups to work around and is always able to reform government to some degree, if a dictatorship is formed in Vic 2, the buttons that initiate changes gray out. You're just stuck until another revolution kicks them out. Victoria 3 is yet to have distinct gameplay with differing governments, aside from the economic impacts as mentioned with command economies or, to some degree, isolationist policies and how those affect one's approach to growth. Total landowner control of power doesn't mean the player cannot invite the industrialists or liberalizing forces into government should they choose. Of course, having aristocracy or a single-party dictatorship or census suffrage and what have you all have different feels and aesthetics to them, but the gameplay isn't drastically changed. Legitimacy is a mutable value that allows compromise where dictatorship in Victoria 2 really does take over. And that leads us to two things: politics and internal struggle. Internal politics is where Victoria shines brightest. It is dually a game of economies and power dynamics, at least for Victoria 3. To go back to our anarcho-liberals, the player is served with disempowerment. They are a dictatorship, which means one cannot hold elections, and they don't want to pass laws, so there's not even variety there. The player is hostage to the regime, and the journey into that despotism isn't exactly compelling. If I had to invent a chart of internal versus external focus for these games, Crusader Kings would be the most internally focused, EU4 and Hoi would be the most externally focused, being games about beating up other countries more than anything, and Victoria is probably closest to the middle. This was true for Victoria 2 near as much as 3, but 3 has given us more political action than ever before. I mean, being frank, it wasn't exactly compelling to drive up militancy intentionally as an abstract point value in order to force reforms. Half the time, liberalizing was done by getting reactionaries so mad that they'd just demand change no matter what it was, which is nonsensical. And the only way to shift the interests of your population was with remarkably gradual consciousness increasing or through election spam, which, though effective, felt remarkably gamey and just tedious. The internal demography and population interests and class and roles existed, but they weren't as clear as in Victoria 3. I mean, look at the absence of feedback going on through this revolution. Comparatively, Victoria 3 gives us interest groups, which have political aspirations and impacts that change based on their relevance, leadership, and even technologies researched. It's far easier to work with, and indeed against, the interest groups than it is to interact with Victoria 2's political movements, which you can only interact with by suppressing or acquiescing to. Internal struggle is turning player agency, player autocracy, and the challenges against it into meaningful gameplay. Victoria 2, with its lack of interactions and extreme abstraction of who these people are and what drives their movement, yes, they want voting laws changed, but who are they, actually leaves the player with less agency. There's less room for expression and the tools are clunky. Manipulating the political current of a country is done largely by forcing up militancy in order to turbo-liberalize, or by forcing up pop interest in order to sway votes, by calling non-stop elections. And indeed, revolutions can be a means towards one's goals. The player isn't dethroned, so a revolution is just a rapid set of law changes and maybe some financial instability. They're completely safe. And even if losing a revolution was a fail state, they happen, or nearly happen, and then dissipate without much feedback. This is not a critique of an over-decade-old game in order to make a case that it's bad, but more to highlight that the ability to interact with systems, autocratically or not, is quite obviously, when I put it this way, meaningful gameplay. But all that said, while the Vic 2 internal conflict might have far less depth to it, the ironic thing is that Victoria 2's pops had far more control over government policy in ways that impeded player action. Declaring war with certain governments was harder. You could be fully disallowed from building anything, from setting taxes above a certain point. Those disempowerments carry more weight than any flat modifier ever could. And I think that's something Victoria 3 could learn from. On the note of war declaration difficulty, Victoria 3's interest groups very noticeably don't impact foreign policy or war declaration, having no voice or power in that realm. A full pacifist government isn't disallowed from starting imperial conflicts. Taking the anarcho-liberals and unfun gameplay as an example to learn from, Paradox might want to try and find the balance between agency and autocracy. And bear in mind, none of this is me saying that the anarcho-liberals were actually really cool mechanically or an interesting gameplay option. They weren't, and there's a reason people dreaded them enough that avoiding them is what comes up most when you search them. But now we can talk about the deeper bits of player autocracy and how rooted it is in these games. Let's take what we've just gone over and draw out some lessons. I originally had a whole section written that outlined shorter versions of the structures of all the other contemporary Paradox titles, but in truth, the point doesn't need so much delving in order to be made. The essence of my findings boiled down to the concept of what these games put in and leave out of focus, and what in turn is left detailed and modeled and what is heavily abstracted. In turn, there's a truism one can apply to these games. If a system is abstract, it's simpler. And if it's simpler, the player's interactions with it will be simpler, and simple is often absolute. To bring back two salient examples, EU4 is indifferent to internal politics, and HOI4 is indifferent to the economy. In EU4, stability is a plus or minus 3 value, and most unique elements of your nation are inherent modifiers. In HOI4, the economy is just wartime resources, a few buttons to occasionally improve them, and consumer goods factories. So, in EU4, there's no gameplay challenge to things that would ordinarily require some sort of internal organizing and deliberation, like, say, church powers. You amass a certain number of abstract points and you can do what you wish. In fact, now that I've said it, that's sort of the design ethos of EU4 entirely, isn't it? In HOI4, you click a button and queue up construction orders or convert civilian factories to military. You click a button in a different menu and the provinces get more resources. It's very blunt. These games, simply put, have their focus elsewhere, but also cannot fully ignore those respective facets of history. These games, in their moments of their most abstraction, tend towards being the most autocratic. The systems can't fight you back when there is no system, after all. But that doesn't make this a consistent correlation, so it obviously comes to us to explain the purpose of abstraction. The simple answer is that abstraction suits gameplay and performance simultaneously. The developer vision of the game and its play for Hearts of Iron doesn't include managing a resource economy with respect to luxury goods and food and all of that, so the abstraction of civilian consumer goods factories suits play. The limited set of resources to manage and lack of complex trade functions or production, or populations of workers, those suit both gameplay design and the performance of the game. The absence of trade goods is not a lacking of depth, it's an application of scope. Put another way, the more in-depth with modeling, the more things the game models, the more intensive the requirements to run it get. In fact, you can see this in how performance tweaks over the lifetime of a given Paradox game don't really make it run smoother than launch so much as reduce the impact of complexified systems and added tags. From here, we can recapitulate. In absolutist cases, the player has developmental control over the nation. If the player never clicks certain buttons, buildings will never get built, development will never increase, and so on. That is a shade of player absolutism, that time may move forward without the player, but progress won't. So is this just a case for more passive elements in these games? Yes and no. I do think there are things to be learned from understanding how empowered the player is, but I don't intend to advocate for drastic gameplay changes, except for one which we'll get to. And I understand that giving the AI even more to do is doubly a balance of leaving room for player agency and of literal game performance, of not having to process too much. Is it a case for disempowerments like the anarcho-liberals? Maybe. They're certainly interesting, but also very certainly risky. At the very least, there is a case to be made for striking the general balance between obstacle and obstruction, between internal conflict as gameplay and what feels like having to wrestle the game into functioning. But that's only one side of player autocracy. I did mention that another angle of it was control of information. It's probably not controversial to say that accurate tooltips and data are helpful in games and avoid frustration that never has the possibility of being fun. Like, it's not an interesting challenge to be lied to about the effects of building a new barracks or something. But there is, I think, an overindulgence in giving the player perfect information in these games, things they shouldn't really know about. Mind you, I'm one of those people who thinks the compass in contemporary Elder Scrolls games is a poor design choice, so that's the kind of person I am. My argument in that genre might actually lead us somewhere here. The short version is that I'm not anti-guidance, but I am anti-forced compass. There's a tendency in the more recent Bethesda titles for the compass to not be a guide, but to be the only way to know where to go. This has been the case since after Morrowind, which is, to many people, obtuse with direction, and I won't fight that battle today. In Skyrim, you reach an objective and the game tells you, magically, where to go next. If you turn off the compass, there is no way to know where to go. At most, characters might point you to a region or a city or say the name of a place you've never been.
Seek out the beast. He wanders these woods. Bring him down and the Lord of the Hunt should smile on you.
But your map knows exactly where you should be. In that setup, the external systems of the game are both necessary and infallible. The game cannot be played without the compass. The path cannot be intuited by the player. And how does that detail of a 3D RPG adventure game connect to 2D historical simulation map games? Well, these games have their own compass of sorts. The ledgers. Perhaps a rare thing for me to do on this channel, but I'm going to advocate a gameplay change. I think the ledger needs to either become diegetic or die. As it stands, the ledger is, like the compass, an infallible external guide. If we stick to the literal ledger, it is less necessary in most contexts. I often get by without ever touching one, but elements of the ledger kind of creep in elsewhere. The expectation of being able to access accurate insider information about another country is part of these games. The ledger is more a representation of that reality than itself the sole issue. It goes from being a nice resource for finding fun things like the most prolific religion in CK2 at the moment to exact troop numbers, information that is strategically critical and should be obscured. Ledger-type systems do have their place, though. They can be an abstraction of worldly knowledge. If you lived in a European urban space in the year 1500, word probably got out to you what the most developed known city in the world was, or at least its regional contenders. You would have heard of Milan, Paris, Constantinople, and so on. Barring doing things like Victoria's newspapers, which I did actually like, or Civ's occasional ranking lists, the ledger is sometimes a good method for including things the player should know, but more often than not, it's only preferable to no information at all. In fact, small tangent for if the devs are listening, bring back the newspapers in Victoria 3, especially now that the game has agitators. I think it would add immense interest with respect to knowing where the big ones have gone, where they've succeeded, when a country is on the brink of bankruptcy, and flesh out general international relations information. Mind you, I don't think a sovereign nation would ever historically arm itself for war with a foreign power just because they read a newspaper saying the opponent is in default, but I think there's something there. Hoi has levels of intel that change what you know about opponents and even allies. I think that should be incorporated more broadly. When looking to the place the ledger has in gameplay, it feels like it smooths things out too much. The absolute information, the infallibility, make it core to the game. More often than not, the ledger becomes a crutch. Information is such an important part of planning and war and trade. Should it not also be the case that gathering said information, of knowing when to trust it, is given a place in gameplay? That's not to say that an absence of information is always compelling. It is genuinely a bit frustrating that, at present, notifications about peace between two foreign nations show up, but we cannot check the terms of that peace. Using best judgment, one can tell when something would probably make the news and when it would be a matter of secrecy, and the end of the Second Austro-Prussian War would probably reach everyone. And I also think it's fine that players can have prior knowledge, historical or otherwise. From a roleplay perspective, it may be silly to know that the Tanzimat is a thing and that in 1856 Romania automatically becomes independent and plan around that, but that's a different kind of information and not the sort of thing the game should clamp down on. Generally, I think the player knows too much and has too much infallible information. But now we reach an equally important question to what is player autocracy, which is, what is the point of giving the player power at all? To which the answer is, to create player agency. And so it follows that we discuss player agency and the point of empowering players. In some sense, there are as many communities that play these games as there are ways to play. There are achievement hunters and challenge runners, AAR writers, and so on. This broad analysis I've done so far, and the emphasis on agency, means leaning more towards what people like AAR writers and role players find fun about these games than what challenge runners look for. I won't claim now, not this far into a video, not with what I know about these games and their appeal, that historical sandboxing is the expected form of gameplay. But to the people who do inhabit the history being played out, who enjoy seeing how things play out differently, for whom these games are a means of playing with history more than playing with spreadsheets, player agency is important. That's not to say that these people don't overlap, that achievement hunters don't also care about cool stories and all that, of course, but there are distinct, differentiable reasons people play these games. However, I'm tempted to say nobody picks up these games with zero interest in history, in the setting. Historicity is a binding element to all branches of players. Or, I don't know, maybe there is someone out there obsessively trying to get the EU4 HRE formation world record who couldn't point out Austria on a map? Player agency is not about making every country's start equally viable, it's about leaving room for historical deviation. Player autocracy is a method of making said deviation more doable, and, importantly, something the player has agency over rather than something that just happens to them. It makes the player active rather than reactive, and frankly, that becomes the issue. It's not about the fact that in the real world country management is harder, or fostering predictability, it's that the balance between frustration and challenge when talking outside the realm of strict difficulty is extremely delicate. But it bears note that, in the light of challenge runners, in the light of player expectations for these games, changing the level of control players have, changing the friction encountered, could potentially just be quote-unquote catering to one side of the player base at the expense of another. What might feel like cool narrative potential to a role player could be a strict nuisance to challenge players, or multiplayer players. That's a concern too, and possibly the largest schism in community and needs when it comes to these games. Challenge is narrative, failure is narrative. Perfect agency means a frictionless experience. AI passivity means a frictionless experience. Winning isn't everything, but losing isn't immaterial. This is not, by the way, a condemnation of loading saves. Play however a game is fun for you. I find the only game I ever really want to Iron Man is Crusader Kings because it has the most room for rolling with the punches rather than something falling apart and meaning a 20-year delay in a game that spans 100 years. And again, these games must facilitate both the options to play into or play against history. Players are given the agency to try and inhabit or push against historical narratives. Roleplay demonstrates the side less concerned with winning and more concerned with possibilities. I can only speak for myself in some conversations I've had, mind you, but there are choices I make because they feel right or they conform to history, even when another choice might be objectively better. Is the Dutch Republic the best option for the Netherlands, or does it just feel wrong to do something else? Sometimes roleplay is bad choices. And from that, we get to the question I can't answer of, is it roleplay to make an ahistorical choice so long as it's possible? Is it roleplay to make better choices for a country than has happened historically? That's where it gets blurry. And sometimes these choices are facilitated by player autocracy, but also sometimes in a sense necessitated. What I mean is that the games can overempower the player, and to that end, radical, dramatic, or exciting historical narratives have to be player-made. The autocrat player must lean into revolution for it to happen, and isn't dethroned with a loss. The mechanics can force concessions and even transformations sometimes, but I imagine it's far more often that the player is at the helm of historical narrative rather than taken on the wild ride of France's turbulent centuries. And so it is that roleplay is concerned with agency in a different way and becomes the best lens through which to understand it. To someone concerned with agency and roleplay, limitations are important, and thus player autocracy is important. To someone concerned with precision and expecting infallible information, player autocracy is important. You want your troops to march where you tell them. Which brings us to warfare. Warfare is one of the things that has historically been both a site of player autocracy and player agency, and arguably the core of gameplay for Paradox for a long time. Or, it can look like that's the case from one perspective. One trend that will help us explore this is to look back on how these games change over time and what they tend to offer, what systems are altered, what new things are modeled. In doing so, you quickly run into the notion that there's nothing to do at peace, or that this or that DLC gives you more to do at peacetime. You hear that Crusader Kings as a game has more to do at peacetime. The implication is that peace is inactive by default in the other games. You notice people mentioning speed 5ing between wars. These are common sentiments. What this says to me is that many people see these games as war games first and foremost, and I don't think they're remotely wrong to believe that. Also, I'd like to table Hearts of Iron for the moment. Of course that's a war game. But when it comes to other games, we have to consider where emphasis is placed in gameplay and, through that, in agency. Autocratically, the trend has been for players to have complete control over troops. This affords an extreme degree of player agency. We direct warfare. Warfare is where the speed 5 gets notched down to a speed 2. I've waded in on occasion to the debate over Victoria 3's warfare. My stance, and I want to make this exceedingly clear because I think there's a willful disconnect here at times, is that it's good of Paradox to try something new, especially for a game that is trying to focus elsewhere. That doesn't mean the first iteration they had, basically pre 1.5, was compelling or amazing, nor does it mean that this is a better system strictly. But I'd like to take the opportunity to press a question that the debate tends to beg but never get to. Was the old warfare system good anyway? And I don't have an objective answer, but I would like to suggest that it wasn't compelling or interesting or tactical so much as the only thread of active gameplay in games like EU4 and Victoria. Without warfare, to some people, the games become waiting. To some people, that warfare was the gameplay. Everything else was prep work, set dressing, modifier chasing. All in service of war to come. The point of a larger economy is a larger military. The gameplay loop is feeding. The game is map painting. Step back for a minute, really step back and think of what an EU4 war montage looks like. Remember what I said about tactics being baiting AI off a siege. Recall experiences with these games, if you have them, and recognize what the challenges are and how they've been overcome. I like to think fondly of my first EU4 Knights campaign, beating and supplanting the Ottomans. Many people like to think fondly of Byzantium doing something similar. But when I look back on those campaigns, I mostly see two things: diplomacy, quote unquote, and sneaky boat spamming. It is telling that with every patch that touched diplomacy or how straight blocking worked, there was a rush to find the new Byzantium strat. This start is dead now because of the favor system. What does that really imply? It implies that France is playing the game for you. That's the whole of tactical genius. Ally France. This strat just got harder because the AI can cross the strait. So the whole thing hinged on one possibility. Is that tactical? Is that good? Or another example still that I think will highlight the odd place the player has in it as a part-time spirit of the nation, part-time supreme commander of the armed forces. What does Skanderbeg gameplay look like? The game can't model guerrilla campaigns in tactical depth, so it looks like an above-average general on defensive terrain, maybe not getting crushed in a single battle. I say this with as much respect as I can. If these are war games, they're not very good ones. The grand of grand strategy is important. Isolate the war gameplay, strip away the other facets, and you're just left with risk but 200 times the tiles, 100 times the game length, and 0 times the friends. I'm not saying this to knock what people consider fun. I've had fun with these games, with wars, but it is, for me, part of a whole. And to argue that warfare in Victoria 3 is bad because it's not Victoria 2 is a distinct argument from Victoria 3 warfare is passive, or indeed, warfare in Vic 3 needs polish. Again, this comes down to fundamental systems. If anything, I feel like people have been, for a long time, arguing that warfare in these games being borderline identical across centuries, both contained to individual games and across the whole collection, is a waste of history, so to speak. Nothing changes in the war gameplay from the 100 Years' War through to Napoleon. Why would it need to? It is itself an abstracted system like many of the others. The difference is that your mode of input is active rather than passive. It's more like gameplay than the rest of the game. On another note, I've often found that the cutoff points of these games exist less to contain an era neatly than so that different systems can be used to model the core of different eras. Crusader Kings didn't need a colonization mechanic for what would arguably be mostly the populating of Iceland and select expansion of North Africa and eastern steppe frontiers. The map itself didn't need a new world that could never be interacted with. 1453 is the end of Crusader Kings because it is, in some argument, the dawn of the Renaissance. It is the time where Crusader Kings mechanics are now insufficient to model history. I often catch myself thinking of these things in terms of warfare, that navies would have to change too much, that artillery adds a different unit type, but in truth, that sort of fault line is exactly what Victoria strides across with the changes of trench warfare. And to finally wrap back around, that's what the front system abstracts. It leaves room for World War I to not use a clashing of blobs of guys model that Victoria II kept from the start. And it removes agency from the player and makes it an indirect system. This is what people dislike, and I'm willing to bet it's largely the people who saw warfare as the active side of the game, as the core of gameplay. Again, I don't care if when you're watching this the system is kind of broken, or as one proud Bavarian would put it, lacking hygiene. Of course it matters that the system isn't broken. Paradox knows this, but they don't have a design doc somewhere that's just the shrug emoji. They have a design doc that explains what the warfare system is supposed to be, how it's supposed to function, and what it is supposed to abstract. Warfare and its changes in Victoria 3 represent less a disempowerment in the sense of an anarcho-liberal takeover where the player is weakened, and more in the way that it is as a mechanical change with an idea behind it. The player still has power, still makes the call on who leads, what they're leading, and the broad strokes of advancing or defending, but warfare is no longer active expression. It joins many other mechanics in being indirect. You can see in the inability to perfectly control how war goes, a design change. You can see in the addition of a shred of control with the Declare Strategic Objective button an attempt to alleviate frustration. Of course it's annoying when the AI takes a battle in the wrong province from what you want, but there's room there to tell a story. There's someone else expressing agency. The computer, from a different angle, is acting as an opponent, an obstacle, and a collaborator in the construction of historical narrative. This is the private sector in another form. Where the private sector makes choices the player might not, so might generals. Frustration partly seeps in from not having a parallel structure one controls as with the government construction. Frustration takes hold when one cannot see the logic of actions that affect them. Or to make a more interesting comparison, the things that made pre-1.5 warfare the most unengaging were the absence of communicated impact. We couldn't even see troops moving places. The feedback was weak. Player input felt weak. This, to me, mirrors how revolutions in Victoria 2 had their own feedback problem. The system can be elaborate and indirect, but failing to communicate what's going on makes it feel simple and bad. And of course, I don't mean that player just has to accept clear error. There's no good reason why the entirety of both sides' armies quit the field and go back to home base once the front line shifts past some random obstacle and is redefined. That's bad, and we have every right to want it to work better, but it's not intended. It's not working as designed, as desired. And from all this, we have the perfect example of the difficulty in putting into practice a change in player autocracy. It's hard to balance, to feel right, and to remove what is in a sense a vector of player agency. Player autocracy is, to a degree, a genre staple, an expectation, and like many expectations, the more we anticipate it, the less we question the necessity or how things might be different. It is not, however, something that should be done away with, so much as recognized for what it is and, in turn, recognized when it smooths away what could otherwise be interesting complexity. At times, this might mean recentering what the gameplay of a game is, but that's happened before, usually in ways we just think of as added depth. Understanding what the player controls and how absolutely they do it also gives us a window into understanding scope, and can hopefully help put to bed those occasional debates about if certain games are bad at things that they aren't even trying to do. Using this lens, we can tease out when it's a question of differing scope or over-abstraction. Player autocracy is something the computer player has as well, and that needs to be considered when we discuss what makes AI feel good. Player autocracy feels gamey at times, but it's how the computer would operate no matter what. It levels the playing field in some sense, just as it makes the games more manageable. It is part of the game where infallibility allows for agency rather than suppressing it. These two things have to be viewed in tandem because both are necessary to gameplay and both define the limits of player agency and gameplay challenge. Overall, I think player autocracy is somewhere where there's more room to shift the balance, where there's more weight we can afford to slide to the other side and keep the balance. It would make things different, of course, but that doesn't ruin challenge, it shifts it, at least ideally. There's risk in experimenting in ways that go against expectation, but without that risk, we're just playing repaints of the same games forever. Okay, well, that was a sort of long one after a fairly long time without a video. Like, what year is it? Haha. It turns out it's apparently hard to find the best angles from which to discuss cross-game genre tendencies and how they intersect all the ways people play. In the meantime, it seems like the Zelda video started doing well, so that's cool. Hopefully the pace will pick back up this year as I bounce between topics like modern Zelda games, the history of Scottish land ownership, and anime game portrayals of World War II atrocities, among other things. Honestly, at this point I don't even know if I have a core audience, but thank you to the people who stuck around for this one, and to the people who finance my ability to continue being like this. Particular thanks goes to Jan Ursaw, Cesare Mikua, Defender, Freddy, Galactic Beyond, Isaac of Lyria, Lissing Afame, Mark Soto, Michael Kelly, Nick, Noun Shawarma, Sipper Turnipsy, and Queen Naked Morat. I don't know what next time will be, honestly, but here's a bad and overly long joke nobody will enjoy.
Slippy, it's General Pepper.
General Pepper here! I have a new mission for you, Fox. You are approaching Dinosaur Planet, an ancient world on the edge of the Lilat system. As you will see, chunks of the planet have been torn from its surface. It's your job to get them back. If Dinosaur Planet explodes, it could affect the entire Lilat system. The only lead we have is that you must locate the Queen of the Earthwalker dinosaur tribe. Maybe she can help you further. Either way, your fee has been approved. If you are successful, then the money will be forwarded to you immediately. Pepper out!
What the fuck's a dinosaur?